Hey, come watch me and some friends play some scary games and talk about Lilo and Stitch dealing with rabies on my new show, Darkness Plays. Look us up on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple. Today, we return to those places that exist, but just barely. Just enough to keep those terrifying things alive and our eyes wide. The middle of nowhere. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you can find me on Twitter at Dark Prevails. Today's episode features chupacabras, wendigo, and strange lights. Enjoy and send me your scary stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org. If you're on Spotify or Apple, leave Unexplained Encounters a rating and review because it really helps. Thank you. Now, let's begin. The Chupacabra of Southern Texas. From Tex-Mex Vaquero 87. The first time I noticed something was off, I didn't think much about it. Working as a farmhand on a sprawling cattle ranch in rural South Texas, you get used to weird noises and unexplained occurrences. The wind howling across the plains can play tricks on your ears, and the long hours under the scorching sun can often make your eyes see things that aren't there. For this story, you can call me Miguel. I've been working at a certain ranch that will go unnamed for a couple of years. It's hard work, but honest. Most days I'm up before dawn, saddling my horse and heading out to check on the herd. We run about 500 head of cattle across a massive acreage of scrubland and mesquite. It's beautiful country, but it can be unforgiving. The kind of place where you always keep one eye on the horizon, watching for dust devils or summer storms rolling in. The first incident happened in late April, just as the bluebonnets were starting to fade and the real heat of summer was creeping in. I was out near the eastern fence line, fixing a section which had come loose in a recent windstorm. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and purples. As I worked, I became aware of this uneasy feeling. It sounds cliché, but I had this feeling like I was being watched. I started to look around, half expecting to see a coyote or maybe a mountain lion eyeing me from the brush. But there was nothing there. Just the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance and the rustle of wind through the mesquite. I shook it off and went back to my work. As it got later, that feeling grew stronger. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could have sworn I heard something moving in the tall grass just beyond the fence line. Something big. I called out, thinking maybe it was one of the other hands playing a joke on me. "Hey, who's out there?" I called. To be honest, I sounded a bit freaked out. There was no response, just more rustling. It was closer now. And then a smell hit me. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before. A mixture of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something alien. I didn't stick around to see what it was. I gathered my tools and hightailed it back to my truck, my heart pounding. As I drove back to the bunkhouse, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something chasing me down the road. When I got back, I didn't mention it to the other hands. They already thought I was a bit soft, being from the city originally. No need to give them more ammunition. That night, though, as I lay in my bunk bed listening to the chorus of snores around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the dark had been sizing me up. The next few weeks passed by without incident. The spring roundup kept us all busy from sunup to sundown, and I managed to push that strange encounter to the back of my mind. But in early June, things started getting weird again. It was Pedro who first noticed something was off with the herd. Pedro had been working cattle longer than I'd been alive, and he's got an almost supernatural sense for when something's not right. One morning at breakfast, he mentioned the cattle seemed spooked, more skittish than usual. "They know something we don't," he said. His weathered face looked concerned. "Animals can sense things." I didn't think much of it at the time, but over the next few days, I started to notice it too. The cattle were clustering together more tightly than usual, even in the heat of the day, and they were quieter, like they were trying not to draw attention to themselves. Then the attacks started. At first, it was just a calf here and a calf there. We'd find them in the morning, weak and listless, with strange puncture wounds on their necks. The boss, let's just call him Mr. Hawkins, figured the same as me, coyotes, or even a mountain lion. He had us start patrolling at night, taking shifts to ride the fence lines with rifles at the ready. Then things got really strange. I was on patrol with Jake, another hand, about a week after the attack started. We were riding along the southern pasture. The moon was low in the sky. It was quiet, very, very quiet. Our horses seemed on edge too, their ears flicking back and forth nervously. Suddenly, Jake's horse reared up, nearly throwing him off. As he struggled to control the animal, I saw something move in the shadows about 50 yards away. It was big, a little bit bigger than a dog, but the shape was all wrong. It seemed to be hairless, with a long snout and powerful hind legs. Before I could get a better look, it was gone, melting into the dark, like a nightmare disappearing at dawn. Jake hadn't seen it. He was too busy trying to calm his horse. When I described what I'd seen to him, he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You've been listening to too many of old Pedro's stories," he said with a nervous laugh, but I could tell he was spooked too. The next morning, we found 3 more calves attacked. This time the wounds were worse. It looked like something had been trying to drain them dry. Mr. Hawkins called the local game warden, but they were as baffled as we were. That's when the whispers started. At first it was just Pedro, muttering about El Chupacabra when he thought no one was listening. But soon the other hands were talking too. Most of them were too macho to admit it, that they believed in things like that. But you could see the fear in their eyes. I didn't want to believe it. Chupacabras were just stories, right? Something made up to scare kids and sell tabloids. But with each passing day, as more animals were attacked and strange things kept happening around the ranch, it got harder to deny that something unnatural was going on. One night, about 2 weeks into the attacks, I was awakened by a commotion outside the bunkhouse. I grabbed my boots and ran out, along with the other hands. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. The entire herd, hundreds of cattle, were pressed up against the corral fences, as far from the open pastures they could get. They were bellowing in terror, their eyes rolling wildly. And there, at the edge of our floodlights, was a shape. It was hard to make out details, but what I could see chilled me to the bone. It was the same thing from before, that thing that I thought looked dog-like, but with this clearer look, it was roughly humanoid, hunched over like some kind of primitive ape. Its skin seemed to be a mottled gray-green, and its eyes reflected the light like a cat's. For a moment, it stood there watching us. Then it let out a shriek that sounded like a cross between a mountain lion and a woman screaming, and vanished into the night. After that night, things escalated quickly. We lost more cattle every night, despite our best efforts to keep them safe. Mr. Hawkins brought in experts. I recall veterinarians, wildlife biologists, even a couple of paranormal investigators. But no one could explain what it was and why this was happening. The atmosphere at the ranch became tense and bordered on panic. Some of the hands quit, unwilling to deal with whatever was out there. Those of us who stayed began to carry loaded weapons at all times, even during the day. We set up trail cameras all over the property, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature. But nothing solid ever came to light. Eventually, Mr. Hawkins decided to sell the ranch. This was grave news to most of us. There was immediately gossip, as folks began to wonder why he was selling. I remember thinking surely it wasn't because of this alleged Chupacabra. But it was a possibility. The night before the new owners were set to arrive, I had the closest encounter yet. I was doing a final patrol of the property, more out of habit than any real hope of stopping the attacks. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds that night. It was quite dark, and I was definitely on edge. As I rode past the old barn, I heard a sound that made my horse stop in its tracks. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. My hand went to my rifle, but before I could even think about raising it, something jumped from the shadows. I caught a glimpse of gray-green skin, glowing red eyes, wickedly curved claws, before my horse reared up and threw me to the ground. I hit hard, the air driven from my lungs. I gasped, and I heard something circling me, with heavy, ragged breathing. I thought I was about to meet a cold and dark end. But, just as suddenly as it appeared, the creature was gone, bounding away into the night, its footsteps fading into the distance until I could no longer hear them. I don't remember how I made it back to the bunkhouse that night, but I know that I did. The following morning, the owners arrived. I handed in my resignation. With the change in ownership and the increasingly dangerous events, I didn't feel comfortable staying. I moved on to work construction in San Antonio, but I still do get creeped out, thinking back to those glowing red eyes and feeling myself being circled by something predatory in the dark. Mountain Road Mimic from MountainRider. This happened about 5 years ago when I was in college. Me, my girlfriend Mia, and our friends Chris and Sarah were driving back from a camping trip in the Appalachians, or as some folks might call it, the Appalachians. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and we were all pretty wiped out. We'd been on these winding mountain roads for hours. The conversation had died down a while back, and the radio was just static. I was focused on driving when Mia spoke up. "Garrett, how much longer until we hit a town or something?" she asked. I glanced up my phone's GPS. Looks like another hour or so. Why? "I really need to use the bathroom," Mia admitted. Chris chimed in from the back seat. "Yeah, me too, actually. And we're almost out of snacks." I sighed. "All right, I'll keep an eye out for a rest stop or gas station or something." We drove for another 15 minutes before finally a sign appeared. "Mountain View Rest Area, 1 mile." As we pulled in, I felt uneasy. The place was deserted, which I guess makes sense for how late it was, but something still felt weird. The fluorescent lights from the restroom building cast this weird glow over the empty parking lot. Maybe it was just that, giving me the spooks. We all got out to stretch our legs. Chris and Mia headed straight for the restrooms. Sarah went to check the vending machines. "I'm gonna look at that map over there," I called out, pointing to the large information board. "Gonna see if there's a quicker way home." As I approached the map, I noticed a strange smell. It was metallic, almost like copper, with this underlying scent of ozone. I figured it was probably just some electrical equipment or something. I was studying the map when I heard footsteps behind me. I assumed it was one of my friends, so I didn't turn around right away. "So, you guys find the bathrooms okay?" I asked. There was no response, just more shuffling. When I turned around, I found myself face to face with an older man, probably in his 60s. His eyes were weirdly alert for how late it was. "Oh, sorry," I said, startled. "I thought you were one of my friends." The man simply stared at me, his head tilted slightly. The way he looked at me was odd. "Are you okay, sir?" I asked, taking a step back. He opened his mouth like he was about to speak, but instead, this low sound came out, like a hum mixed with chattering teeth, but not quite. It definitely wasn't a normal human sound. My heart started to race. Every instinct was telling me to run, but I was frozen in place. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Whoa, easy there!" It was Chris, looking at me with concern. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." I spun around, but the old man who had just been there was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere in the parking lot. "Did you see that? The old guy?" I asked, my voice shaking. Chris furrowed his brow. "What old guy? We're the only ones here, dude." I shook my head, trying to clear it. "Never mind. Must have been my imagination. This place is creeping me out. Let's get the girls and go." We walked back to the car, where Sarah was already waiting with an armful of snacks. Mia joined us a moment later, looking a bit pale. "You all right?" I asked her as we got back in the car. She nodded, but her eyes were darting around nervously. "Yeah, well, did any of you smell something weird in the bathrooms? Like a metallic smell?" A chill ran down my spine. I remembered the scent I'd noticed earlier. "Actually, yeah. I smelled it too, over by the map." "Probably just old pipes," Chris suggested with a shrug. "This place looks ancient." We pulled out of the rest stop, all of us feeling a bit on edge. About 10 minutes down the road, Sarah spoke up from the back seat. "Does anyone else hear that?" We all fell silent. At first, I didn't hear a thing over the engine, but then I caught it, a rhythmic thumping coming from the rear of the car. "Probably just something shifting in the trunk," I said, trying to sound confident. "We'll check it out when we get to town." But the sound kept going, growing louder. It wasn't random, like you would expect from luggage moving around. This was steady and deliberate. "Garrett?" Mia's voice was tight with fear. "Pull over. Now!" I guided the car into the narrow shoulder of the road. As soon as we stopped, the thumping ceased. We sat there for a moment, then wordlessly got out of the car. The forest was pressed in close on both sides of the road there. It was eerily quiet, too. I couldn't hear crickets or even rustling leaves. Chris walked around to the trunk and cautiously popped it open. We all peered inside, but there was nothing there, just our camping gear, exactly as we'd packed it before. "See," I said, forcing a laugh. "Probably just the spare tire coming loose or something." But as I moved to close the trunk, I noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper tucked between my tent and sleeping bag. I was certain it hadn't been there before. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it. Scrawled in jagged letters were 5 words that made my blood run cold. "I am in your car." I looked over to my friends. Their faces were pale in the harsh glare of the flashlight. Before I could say anything, a low chuckle emanated from inside the car. We all whirled around. There in the back seat where Sarah had been sitting moments ago was the old man I'd seen from the rest stop. For a split second, we all stood frozen in horror. Then, as if a spell had been broken, We all ran blindly into the forest, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. Behind us, we could hear that awful chittering sound, growing louder, closer. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually, gasping for breath, we stumbled into a small clearing. What the heck was that thing? Chris panted, bent over with his hands on his knees. What do you mean, thing? I choked out. I don't know, Chris replied, but I don't think that was a person. There was something wrong with his face. Did you see the way his skin was moving? I swallowed. We need to keep moving, guys. We need to find some help. That's when we realized Sarah wasn't there with us. Oh my God, where's Sarah? Mia said. Sarah! She called out. Sarah, where are you? There was no response, just that same eerie silence. We huddled together in the clearing, straining our ears for any sound of our missing friend. Minutes ticked by, each second stretching out so long. Then from the dark, we heard Sarah's voice. Guys, where are you? I got turned around out here. I felt so relieved. Over here, Sarah! Follow our voices! She then emerged from the tree line, looking disheveled but unharmed. As she approached, I noticed something odd about the way she walked. It was slightly off, as if she was having trouble coordinating her own movements. You okay? I asked, as she joined our group. Did you see where that thing went? Sarah cocked her head to the side, reminding me way too much of the old man from the rest stop. When she spoke, her voice was flat too, devoid of any emotion. What thing? I just got a little lost, that's all. A chill ran down my spine. There was something wrong with Sarah. Mia sensed it too. She took a small step back and asked, Sarah? What's the name of the campground we stayed at this weekend? Sarah's face remained blank. The campground? It was. Suddenly, that inhuman chittering sound filled the air again. We all stumbled back. It was coming from Sarah's mouth. Go, 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 I yelled, grabbing Mia's hand and pulling her with me as we plunged back into the forest. We ran for a long time, the sound of someone following us always close behind. Sometimes it sounded like Sarah calling for help. Sometimes it sounded like Chris or Mia too, even though they were right there with me. One time, and I swear to you I'm not lying, I heard my own voice pleading for the others to wait. But we didn't listen, we didn't stop, we didn't look back. As the first light of morning began to filter through the trees, we finally emerged onto a road. A passing trucker took pity on us and gave us a ride to the nearest town, where we immediately went to the police. The sheriff listened to our story with a mix of skepticism and concern. Look, he said finally, we'll send a search party out for your friend. But I gotta tell you, we've had some strange reports from that area before. Hikers getting lost, weird sightings. Most folks around here know to avoid that stretch of road after dark. They searched the area and found our car abandoned on the side of the road. They did not find any evidence of anything unusual, save for some strange scratches on the inside of the trunk. But there was no sign of Sarah. For 3 days, search and rescue teams combed the forest. We stayed in town, giving statements to the police and waiting for news, sometimes even joining in on the search when they allowed. On the afternoon of that third day, just as we were starting to lose hope, we got the call we'd been praying for. They found Sarah. She was dehydrated, covered in scratches and bruises, but she was alive. When we got to the hospital, Sarah was lying in a hospital bed, looking pale and exhausted. But when she saw her friends, her face lit up with relief. "Oh my God, you guys," she said, her voice hoarse. "I thought I'd never see you again." We hugged her, all of us crying with relief. But as the initial joy wore off, we couldn't help but ask the questions that had been haunting us. "Sarah," I said gently, "what happened to you out there? What do you remember?" She frowned, then she concentrated. "It's all blurry or black to me. I remember running through the woods. Felt like someone was chasing me, but every time I looked back, I didn't see anyone. I kept hearing voices, sometimes yours, sometimes a voice I didn't recognize. I didn't know what I was hearing, didn't know where I was going. I remember a strange man in the back seat, but, well, never mind." "What do you mean, Sarah? You can tell us." Chris pressured her. Mia put a hand on his chest, trying to get him not to press her, but Sarah spoke up. "All right, it's okay, Mia. I'll tell you. You know that strange man? When I saw him in the back seat, it didn't look like a person. It looked like something holding a mask that looked like a man's face. That's why I ran. That's why I thought you all ran. Why would we run if it was just some stranger in the back of the car?" We all looked at each other, silent for a while, probably disturbed, because I know I was. The doctors said Sarah was suffering from extreme dehydration and exhaustion, which could explain her disorientation and memory issues. They kept her in the hospital for a few days for observation, but beyond that, she was going to be fine. In the weeks that followed, we tried to piece together what had happened that night. Sarah's memories remained fragmented, but she never mentioned seeing anything else weird after we ran off. The police chalked it up to a case of group hysteria. Maybe we were all exhausted, and the stress of getting lost in the woods at night made us see and hear things. But I know what I saw, and we all know what we saw. That chittering sound. It's something that I will never forget. And I hate to say it, but ever since we heard that sound coming from Sarah's mouth, I can't really look at her the same way, even though I know it wasn't her. Something that looked like Sarah came out of those woods and approached us. My friend group doesn't go camping anymore. We don't even stop at rest areas after dark. We'd rather wait it out in the car or not take the trip at all. If you're hearing this and planning a trip through some remote area, especially near the Appalachians, be aware of your surroundings. If you get that feeling in your gut that something just isn't right, listen to it. Don't brush it off like we did. I think there are things out there in the dark, things that can wear familiar human faces. Things that I don't think are actually human at all. Small Town Mysteries. From Fern 2. I'm Russian with Romanian and German heritage. From the ages of 1 through 12, I lived in Russia with my mom and stepdad. When I was 5 or 6, my mom was single and overworked, so she sent me off to a small town in the middle of nowhere to live with my grandmother, who was more than happy to take me in. For the first few months of my visit, everything was going well. My grandmother found a daycare in town for me, and I even made a few friends there. Meanwhile, she had a job at a school for disabled kids. The day was like any other, a foggy morning with damp air and gray skies. My grandmother woke me up at around 9 a.m. to take me to the daycare. What happened most of the day is irrelevant. At roughly 3 p.m., though, a storm started to brew, rain pattering on the roof of the small building, and the occasional lightning and thunder leaving the kids slightly frightened. Eventually, the storm got a bit intense. The wind picked up speed and the rain tapped more aggressively. I'd always been a brave, or maybe a stupid, kid, so while the others hovered under tables or other objects, I asked one of the supervisors to tell me ghost stories. I thought it was the perfect time as the power had gone out, and all we had to light up the room were cheap lanterns and candles. The supervisor simply sighed. While the other supervisors were trying to get the power back on, she gathered a small crowd of kids like me and began to tell stories. As you could imagine, they were just regular stories to scare kids. Stories of kind ghosts or things in the forest. I don't recall much of what happened in them. However, one of the stories stuck out from the rest. It was about a lone hiker going on a long hike and stumbling into our village and into our woods, coming out later dazed and babbling about weird creatures in the pond and giant dogs. This story was particularly creepy because of the way she told it, as if it was from eyewitness memory and not simply a story. Her eyes went all distant as she recounted it. The other kids huddled together as another flash of lightning struck nearby, lighting up the area for a short moment. I looked out the window, and before I continue, I'd like to say the forest was a few miles from the daycare, surrounding it from right to left in all directions except one. Anyway, I looked out the window and my eyes widened. It causes me physical pain to describe it accurately, but I'll try my best. But that day, I swear I saw this kind of creature. Tall, and I mean too tall, unlike anything in nature that my child eyes had ever seen before. It looked like a terrifying mix of werewolf and deer, except instead of eyes, there were only gaping holes. For a second, I stared at it, and if it had eyes, I think it would be staring at me too. Just as I was about to point it out, it disappeared. Paralyzed by fear, I just stared out the window, unable to move and eventually forcing myself to speak. I turned to the supervisor and I said, "Miss K, that story about the hiker, what kind of big dog did he see? You mean like a husky or something?" Miss K paled as I asked her the question. Her voice dropped to a raspy whisper. "Don't ask questions, dear. It doesn't like people poking around," she replied, looking out the window for a split second before shuddering. The other kids had left already and returned to their normal spots, playing with dolls or cars. The other adults had gotten the power back on, and everything seemed okay. A few hours later, my grandmother came to pick me up, and we drove home together. She made tea, and we sat down to eat some cookies. Determined to find out what I'd really seen, I said something. "Granny, have you ever heard of a hiker in our town?" I asked, taking a sip of my tea as I awaited an answer. My grandmother simply nodded. "Ah, yes, back when I was young and beautiful, I used to work as a bartender in our local club. Truth be told, many strange people came through there. But one man caught my attention. An outsider with not much knowledge of Russian came by. He sat down in front of me and ordered wine. I brought him a glass. He looked bothered by something, so I asked about it. He clutched my hands in his own in a shaky grasp and started to babble about large dogs with no eyes. I figured he had lost his mind, or I'd misunderstood, as his Russian wasn't very great. That was a strange day for sure, she explained, calmly sipping her tea. I was shocked. I looked out the window again, almost sensing something out there looking back at me. Several years later, around my 10th birthday, a few of my friends from school and I decided to have a birthday camping trip. I'd always liked the outdoors, and having company was even better than camping alone. When my grandmother gave her approval, we started to plan. On the day, my two friends, Lucy and Emily, and I went out into the wilderness, in that same forest near my former daycare, in fact. We hiked for a bit, picking flowers and climbing trees. Eventually, the sun started to set, so we found ourselves a small clearing and set up camp. We'd packed one big tent for the three of us to share and soon set that up. As darkness approached, We started to cook some food over a makeshift fire, telling jokes and gossiping about boys. When the last traces of daylight exited the sky, I felt a sudden chilling feeling, like I was being watched. I looked around, only to find nothing out of place. I urged Emily and Lucy to go back into the tent. They agreed, but laughed it off as me being a scaredy cat. We extinguished the fire and set up our sleeping bags in the tent, zipping it up and lying down. About an hour later, I heard a howling-like sound, except this one didn't sound natural. It was like a howl and a scream, but the screaming half was more human than animal. I shook Emily awake, as Lucy was pretty dense and wouldn't believe me. "Emmy, did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded. "I do, but what is it?" she replied, rubbing sleep out of her eyes. "Maybe just a wolf," I offered hopefully, only to have her shut me down. "Wolves don't scream like little girls," she said, firmly before freezing, her shaking hand pointing at the tent wall behind me. I turned around to look, and what I saw made me bite my lip to keep myself from screaming. There was a shadow on the wall, very similar to the creature I saw back at the daycare. The howl screaming was coming from just outside. Neither Emily nor I slept at all that night. By the time dawn arrived, we were scared to death and itching to leave. We woke Lucy up and packed up our things, running out of the woods and never coming back. From then on, I used to have these migraines where I would hear the howl screaming. I would have dreams about that creature staring at me with those gaping holes for eyes. Eventually, I left that village, moving all the way to Canada, where I now reside. The memories of that night and my childhood experience still haunt me, even on my way out of college. The Not Deer Came Back. From Sean M. Warning: this story contains depictions of violence against animals. This is an update to the previous story I submitted, The Not Deer That Hunted Me. It's been about 1.5 years or so since I first encountered that creature in the woods of Alabama in my backyard. To be completely honest, I'd thought it would simply leave and not come back. But I was a fool to think that. It did come back. For those unfamiliar with my previous story, I am a senior in high school. I live in Alabama on my parents' property out in the middle of nowhere. Our house is surrounded by thick woods on all sides, excluding the path through it that leads to civilization. In the last 1.5 years, I have strong reason to believe I came across the cryptid known as a Wendigo. I was out hunting in the middle of the night, shot it thinking it was a deer, and it chased me out of the woods, terrorizing me and my girlfriend from outside my house. It can mimic voices almost perfectly, and it disguised itself as a larger buck. It nearly killed me. Ever since, I've been referring to this creature as the Not Deer. I was hunting by myself in the middle of the woods, wearing my now professionally tailored ghillie suit camouflage. Laying down on my stomach, I was essentially invisible to any game animals that could be roaming in the forest. With me was my dad's old bolt-action sniper rifle equipped with an infrared scope. I also had my Glock, hunting knife, a flashlight, first aid kit, and a shovel. I'd been out there for about 4.5 hours. The sun was completely down. The only light sources I had were my flashlight and the reflected light of the full moon in the sky. The shadows of the trees were long and creepy. The crickets were chirping, and the occasional echo of an owl's hoot would sound through the woods. Suddenly, all at once, everything went quiet. Quiet enough to hear the hypothetical gears in my brain turning. I was put on edge, reminded quickly of one of the things that could bring that type of silence in its wake. A bear or a mountain lion. But I was hyped. Those types of enormous predators were rare, and I'd only ever seen a few of them lumbering around in my woods. Sure enough, a black bear came tromping through the trees right in front of me. But what caught my eye was that it appeared to be bleeding rather badly. It collapsed at the base of a large tree and began to fervently lick its left paw. While the bear was minding its own business, I lay on the floor in my camouflage, debating whether I should shoot this bear or not. My decision came when a small baby bear came scampering out of the brush towards the first bear, who I now realized was a mother. It's highly frowned upon to orphan bear cubs, so I lowered my rifle and simply enjoyed the rare scene playing out before me. I was wrong to think that there would be a happy ending to this. Like a cat pouncing on a mouse, a large thing came hurtling out of nowhere, launching itself at the baby bear. There was the horrible sound of its cries, followed by it being dragged away into the brush. That sound will haunt me forever. At the same time, the mother bear sprang up and charged after her cub to rescue it. But she was violently thrown back by something, the same something that had attacked her baby. The baby bear's cries were suddenly silenced as the mother bear struggled to regain her footing. I couldn't believe what I was watching. The attacker revealed itself, lunging for the heavily injured mother bear. My worst fears had once again come true. It was that not deer thing. Its image had been burned into my mind. At this moment, it was somewhat poorly disguised as a larger buck, with an enormous set of antlers on its head. However, it always appears as if it hasn't eaten in months. I could see its ribcage through the tightly bound skin, with a few patches of fur missing. Its eyes were milky white, giving it the appearance of being blind. Instead of hooves on its front legs, I saw very sharp, inches-long claws on rather human-like hands. Its mouth was also filled with horribly carnivorous-looking sharp teeth. It stood on its hind legs like a person, and for the chef's kiss of horror, it gave off a stench that smelled like Hugh Jackman's Wolverine clawing his way out of his grave, all while forgetting to regenerate. Unlike my last encounter, the knot deer was covered in both fresh and dried blood. It looked like some of the skin on its face had been torn off. I could see white bone on its skull as it screeched its horrible screech and tore into the mother bear. Scarlet liquid was spattered everywhere as the bear soon stopped moving, either dead or too weak to defend herself. And there I was, maybe 20 meters away, lying on the floor with my eyes frozen wide and my hands trembling. God, I can't get that scene out of my head. Every time I think about it, it makes me want to violently vomit. There wasn't much left in the semblance of a bear by the time the knot deer was finished. What disgusted me the most was that it didn't even seem to have the goal of eating either of its kills. That sadistic thing, which was now just standing completely still, had slaughtered 2 poor bears, seemingly for the heck of it. I felt terrified, and now sad and angry. I raised my rifle and put the scope's crosshair on the knot deer's head. As I now expected, the infrared showed it didn't give off any body heat. A year ago, when I shot it, I had aimed for its heart, but this demonic thing had shrugged off a direct hit to its heart, like I had simply spat at it. I wasn't entirely confident that this time I would actually succeed in hunting it, but it was worth a try. What scared the crap out of me was when the monster suddenly turned its head right towards me. Did it know where I was? Did it hear my heart thumping? Did it smell my fear? Whatever the case, I closed my eyes and squeezed the trigger, praying it would buy me enough time to gain the Flash's superpowers and nope my rear out of there. The muzzle flash of my rifle briefly illuminated the grisly scene before me, and I heard a loud clack and the knot deer's scream. As I opened my eyes, I saw the round fall to the forest floor as it bounced off the creature's skull. The shot did nothing except tee that not deer off. In any case, I dropped the rifle and freaking ran. I could hear the thing close behind me as we both weaved through the trees, the thing screeching with rage. I didn't think it was possible for me to run any faster than I did on the first night I encountered that horrid thing, but I managed to stay one step ahead of it and just out of reach. It felt like I ran forever, but I eventually made it back to my house. Even though I honestly doubted my home would provide much protection, it did make me feel a bit better. The not deer seemed unable to enter the house without being directly let in by someone else. Sounds like a vampire, right? But it's just what happened. It was summer vacation. My parents were very conveniently out of town, so I was essentially screwed. The police wouldn't believe my story, and the only other person that did believe me was back at her house about half an hour away. By then, the moon had been obscured by a cloud. It was pitch black out. Even the porch lights from my house didn't seem to penetrate this extraordinary dark. I pulled my handgun out of its holster on my belt and flicked off the safety, holding it in front of me. A stupid image of me starring in a Call of Duty game briefly flashed through my head as I remembered I was still wearing my Bush Boy outfit. However, the seriousness of my situation came rushing back as I heard a tapping on the front door, followed by my mother's voice.
"We're home. Let us in."
I didn't respond. Then I heard my father's voice.
"Open the door, son. Let me in."
If it weren't for the voice of my dad saying me, then anyone else would have thought that it really was my parents outside. But I knew better. This thing had not perfected the English language. Why say let me in when there were supposedly two of you outside? But my thought process was interrupted by the pretender out there, rapidly switching between the voices of my parents before they both seemed to speak in unison. Let us in, let me in, let me in. Needless to say, I did not let them in, or it. Instead, I used the remaining adrenaline I had in my system to shove the living room couch in front of the door. There was no one coming to help me, so I had to do my best to protect myself. I eventually passed out, hearing that thing outside screaming. A few hours later, I woke up in the same exact spot, spread-eagled on the floor in the living room. The sun was poking up over the horizon outside. I looked up and saw that there were 5 jagged diagonal holes in the front door. The not deer had scratched its way through the door. What I didn't understand was, why stop there? Why didn't it break the door down and drag me out? I picked up my gun and peeked out one of the holes in the door, but saw nothing. Even so, I didn't trust it. By now I knew that thing was a trickster. It could simply be hiding just out of sight, waiting for me to emerge from the safety of my house. My phone rang and I saw that my girlfriend, MJ, was calling me, like she would every day. As much as I wanted to pick up, I hastily silenced my phone so that nothing outside would hear it. Sure enough, I suddenly heard leaves shifting outside. Something was beginning to pace back and forth, seemingly on 4 legs, in my backyard. After a while, though, I could hear the footsteps becoming fainter and fainter as the not deer retreated back into the forest. As for me, I didn't even step foot outside for 3 days after it left. Though this might sound strange, I didn't attempt to repair the scratches in the front door. I wanted to make sure that the not deer did not try one of its mimicry tricks again. Now that I think about it, my paranoia may have saved me from being snatched up by that horrible thing stalking me in my own house. On the 4th day following the encounter, I finally went outside again, armed of course. There, sitting in the grass of my backyard, was the head to a young bear. I stared at it for a minute, before again sealing myself within the walls of my house. Eventually, my parents came back. They were furious about the door. They forbade me from hunting anymore. And quite frankly, I don't really want to. But I swear that thing came back again and again anyway. Every time it does, something in my life goes wrong. Once I saw it on the way to school. It just stood on two legs in the shadow of a distant tree, watching me. That same day, MJ broke up with me. Her reason being, I don't want to be involved in all this scary monster crap. My grades have been dropping and I'm losing some of my closest friends. I see that knot deer on almost a daily basis. It never moves, it just stays completely still and stares. Is it wanting to make my life miserable, rather than dragging me away into the woods to finally exact its revenge on me? I have no idea. Maybe I'm just going crazy. Predator. From Kelton Storm Baseball number 9. My dad and I are avid hunters. We always go hunting together just in case something happens. We have bobcats and wild boar on our property. Being 11 years old, I often had friends over who also enjoyed hunting. And one day, we were taken out to hunt wild boar. I remember how it happened. We had a really long, unsuccessful hunt, but on the way back on the dirt road, my friend's dad spotted a group of 3 pigs. Seeing it as his last chance, my dad pulled out his 6.5 Creedmoor and shot at the black boar in the front, which was drinking water from the pond. He hit it, but it only dropped about 5 feet from where it had been shot and a few feet away from some trees. Suddenly, a black dog-like figure came out of the tree cover and howled. It looked at my dad, then walked over to the pig, scooped it up with jagged razor-sharp teeth, and dragged the dead animal back into the tree cover. Terrified, we put the gun away and got out of there as fast as we could. When we got back to the house, no one talked about the event until dinner. My friend Case whispered to me that he thought it was a misfigured abandoned dog. But I reminded him that we had a high fence surrounding the whole property. It would be nearly impossible for even a normal dog to jump that fence. Case and I went to my room and drew the supposed dog. We came to the conclusion maybe it was a skinwalker, a word that makes your skin crawl when you say it. We figured it had been a deer when it jumped over the high fence, then changed into something else. We both decided to keep it a secret because we figured nobody would believe us. After they left at about 4 in the morning, my dad said he saw something on the trail cam, something he described as a large, dark dog standing over a deer. I would later find out that the dog, to him at least, looked distorted. It looked right at the camera before walking away, and as soon as the dog was gone, the deer itself got up like it had been playing dead and ran away as fast as it could. As creepy as it sounds, my dad and I went out about an hour after that. We got in my dad's truck and had 2 minutes left until we got to the gate, when we saw a pale, tattered, and distorted armadillo. Normally, armadillos scurry away from vehicles, but this one went right in front of our slow-moving truck to crush itself. We looked at each other in horror. When we finally got to the gate, we paused and waited, getting our phones out until the sun gave enough light for us to see. We kept going then, checking the site for 10 minutes, when we heard this ear-shattering screech. We hightailed it out of there so fast, the truck was basically out in 2 minutes on a 4-mile road. We were home quick. We locked the door as soon as we got inside and watched the property in front of ours out the window, rifle in hand. After about 10 minutes, we checked the other doors, which were locked. At the time, my mom and sister were out getting their nails done, so my dad and I waited for them to get home with anxiety, focusing on the trail cameras. To this day, my dad and I call that thing we've been seeing the Predator. Light on the forest floor. From ItsKelbyOwen. It was rifle season in Pennsylvania, back in 2012 when I was 14. I was going out deer hunting alone. I was never really scared of anything growing up, except for snakes and spiders. Hated those things. That being said, other than that, I was never scared of anything in the woods. Growing up in the smallest little town in my county, if you want to call it a town, it was more like a village, I learned from my dad and Pap to always be a strong, fearless man, seeing that I have never seen them scared of anything in my entire life up to this point. It was a calm, wet, warm evening when I went out to my Pap's enclosed tree stand in our biggest field on the farm. I had been hunting on this farm as far back as I could remember, and it had always been my safe space. Unfortunately, until this evening. I had Old Reliable with me. That's what I call him anyway. Old Reliable is my Savage Stevens Model 200 .243 caliber deer rifle that my dad bought for me when I was 10. He never let me down once, and to this day is still my favorite hunting rifle. I got myself situated in the deer stand around 3 p.m. Any later than that, and my Pap would be harping on me that I was going out too late, and that I'd be scaring the deer off walking in that late to the stand. I always laughed at that, being that I've never had an issue walking in at 3, or a little later, for an evening hunt. Some time passed, and around here it gets pretty much dark at 5:30. I've always had no issue seeing deer a little bit before that. This particular evening was different. Normally, deer were out and about around 4:30 or later to feed here at the farm. They've always come out in the time periods between 3:30 and 5:30. But that night, nothing came out to the field to feed, not even the squirrels. It was getting closer to the 5:15 to 5:30 time frame. I started to see what looked like a hunter walking down in the hollow on my grandfather's property. I got off my chair in the tree stand, and I started watching down into the hollow, not saying a word yet to the person that I thought was there. I see then what looks like a hunter's headlamp on top of their head. I thought it was someone that had shot a deer with their bow. Some people do hunt with their bows during rifle season around here, but not too many. The pine forest that I'd mentioned beforehand was not on my grandfather's property. I figured the person that owned that property had shot a deer, and they were out looking for it. Maybe the deer had run out onto my grandfather's land. Now it was getting dark, and they had to use their headlamp. At this point, it's pushing 5:30, and it's pretty dark out. I'd made the decision to yell out of the front of the tree stand at this person to tell them that they were trespassing, and that if they have a blood trail, I will help them find their deer and get them off the land. I yelled out such in a stern voice. As soon as I said it, the light stopped, as if the person was standing still now. I didn't get a response. Then the light just stayed where it was for 10 minutes. Fast forward around 5:40, it was completely dark now. The light began to move again, now moving forward, towards me. All the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Mind you, this light was about 100 yards away, but still moving towards me. I was frozen, not really sure what to do. All of a sudden, the light just shot right up in the air, zigzagging back and forth and shot up in the air again. Then it came down towards me in the tree stand, then went off to the left, towards the pine forest. I was scared and puzzled at the same time. I didn't know what was going on or what to think, but I knew what I saw. My eyes were not lying to me. Suddenly, there was a blood-curdling scream over in the pine woods. It sounded like it was less than 50 yards away. You better believe I gathered my stuff right away and made my way through the 150-yard run to my Pap's side-by-side, my head on a swivel and rifle ready. I was ready for anything, and out of breath as I got to the side-by-side. I practically threw myself into the seat, starting up the vehicle and peeling out of the field. I had never been so scared before. I got back to the house to see my Pap in the basement, waiting for me to ask me what I saw. I just told him I didn't see anything. I kept what happened to myself, and I've kept it to myself to this day. That was the last time and only time it's ever happened to me. I've been back there since, and I still get that eerie feeling every time I go back. But the hunting's good, so I keep going, praying that nothing bad ever happens again. If anything like this has happened to you or someone else, I'd love to have an explanation. Thanks for listening. Feels good to finally get the experience off my chest. Thank you for tuning in to Unexplained Encounters. If you're not already, follow and listen to Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Leave us a rating while you're at it. Get some cool creepy merch at eeriecast.store. Check out my other show where I narrate scary work stories. It's called Tales from the Break Room. For more terrifyingly entertaining shows from EerieCast, go to eeriecast.com. And if you want to listen to Unexplained Encounters and all the other EerieCast shows without pesky ads, sign up for EerieCast Plus at eeriecast.com/plus. You'll also get exclusive access to horror audiobooks only available to EerieCast Plus members. And you'll get 20% off our EerieCast.store merch through our members-only monthly discount code. Finally, if you have a scary story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. I think that's about it. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.